Today's tough question, can a Christian go to AA? Well, welcome back to more tough questions about addiction. My name is Joe Herzanek and I'll be your host. Perhaps the bigger question is, can biblical Christianity, the New Testament, and 12-step teachings work together, or is there some kind of conflict? Well, it's a silly question for some people because a lot of people in faith communities already do attend 12-step groups. But for some, this is still a bit of a challenge, and we want to talk about that today, why I bring this up. Several years ago, I went to a training at Taylor University in Fort Wayne, Indiana. This was chaplains from all over, county jail chaplains from all over the country. 60 or 70 of us came together for a training, and the training was called ACTS, A-C-T-S, American Chaplaincy Training School. Dr. Tom Beckner was the facilitator for this particular program. And we had classes all week long. We took over the dorm rooms and we just lived together for a little over a week there at Taylor University. Well, a few days into this training, I noticed that there really wasn't any mention or talk about addiction, substance abuse, those kinds of things, and we are all chaplains and we have to deal with this every day. So at the end of one of the days, I asked one of the chaplains I met, he was from the Cook County Jail in Chicago, and I said, I forget his name, but I asked him, I said, I don't see any mention of addiction recovery, 12-step groups, and things like that. What do you think? Should that be part of our training? And this guy says, well, they only need one step, and that's Jesus. So that thinking is still around, still pervasive in some particular faith communities. So I want to talk about how the early AA group started. Back in 1935, it was the summer of 1935, that Dr. Bob Smith and Bill Wilson came together and this thing got its start. At that time, they didn't have any literature. They did not have what they call a big book now, Alcoholics Anonymous. They didn't have the 12-step book. They had basically, well, what I'm going to read from right now is a book called Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers. And this is what he says about the early adventures of the 12-step program. Dr. Bob, noting that there were no 12 steps at the time and that our stories didn't amount to much of anything. Later, he said, they were convinced that the answer to their problems was in the good book. To some of the older ones, the parts that we found absolutely essential were the Sermon on the Mount, chapter 13 from 1 Corinthians, and the book of James. This was the beginning of AA's flying blind period. They had the Bible. A little farther on page 131 from the same book, they list 7 essentials for recovery and for what came to be known as Alcoholics Anonymous. So, number 1, an alcoholic must realize that he is an alcoholic and incurable from a medical viewpoint. And he must never again drink anything with alcohol in it. Number 2, he must surrender himself absolutely to God, realizing that in himself there is no hope. Number 3, not only must he want to stop drinking permanently, he must remove from his life all other sins such as hatred, adultery, and others which frequently accompany alcoholism. Unless he is willing to do this absolutely, Smith and his associates will refuse to work with him. Number 4, he must have morning devotions and a quiet time of prayer and some reading from the Bible and other religious literature. Unless this is faithfully followed, there is a grave danger of backsliding. Number 5, he must be willing to help other alcoholics get straightened out. This throws up a protective barrier and strengthens his own willpower and convictions. Number 6, it's important but not vital that we meet frequently with other alcoholics and form both a social and religious comradeship. Finally, number 7, important but not vital that he attends some religious service at least once weekly. So the early AAs and Dr. Bob and Bill Wilson believed that their roots, their teachings all came out of the New Testament. There's also a concern, why is there no mention in this today, in the 12-step groups today? Why don't they talk about the Bible? Well, that's a good question. What they discovered early on was that they needed to focus on what they call their primary purpose. Why do they exist? What do they hope to accomplish? What is their primary purpose? Companies do this, organizations do this all the time. They have a mission statement. But they decided their primary purpose was to help alcoholics and people who struggle with drugs, for that matter, overcome their substance use and abuse. And just as an aside, so to speak, Dr. Bob had a dual addiction, alcohol and also sedatives he took. He was a doctor, and it was easy for him to get sedatives at his work. What they found out very early on was that they were having tremendous success, and people were coming to their groups from all faiths. They had Catholics, they had Protestants, they had people who followed Judaism, they had agnostics, they had atheists. So in order to have a welcoming sort of place for all faith groups, they decided to just focus on their primary purpose, which was to help other alcoholics to achieve sobriety. There's another book I want to quote from and talk about for a minute. This is What Good is God? By Philip Yancey. Philip Yancey is an award-winning New York Times best-selling author. He's written several books. He's a conservative Christian. He's a pastor. And in his book, What Good is God? Basically what he does here is handle, you might say, tough questions or hot topics. So in his book, What Good is God? Chapter 19, I'm not going to read from it, but chapter 19 is titled, Why I Wish I Was an Alcoholic. Now, a conservative Christian pastor is asking that question or making that statement, why I wish I was an alcoholic. Why does he wish that? Well, what he has found from his study and from people in his congregation is that alcoholics at 12-step groups have a unique way that they can come together. They're transparent. They talk about the challenges, the struggles. In the 12-step groups, they encourage you to get a sponsor, which in the faith community might be an accountability person, someone that you could do one-on-one conversations with and work through specific struggles. The steps were just a foundation, a path, you might say, to build a new life on. They are loaded with talks about God. They have mentioned God in several of their steps. I personally believe that there is no conflict with the 12-step groups and with faith communities. And it's kind of unique that they don't mention the Bible, but they do actually quote Scripture oftentimes at the end of a 12-step meeting. How do they do that? Where do they get that from? They quote from the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus' disciples asked him how to pray. At the end of most 12-step groups, you will hear people get in a circle, hold hands, bow their heads, and say the Lord's Prayer. So they do use some Scripture, whether they realize it or not, and it seems to be working pretty well. So thanks for tuning into this. I talk a lot more about this in my book, Why Don't They Just Quit? I've written articles on this. You can go to our website, changinglivesfoundation.com. There's several hundred links, different topics, all related to substance use, and we cover just about everything. So thanks for tuning in to this particular question, which is a really hot topic. And next week we're going to get even hotter, I think. We're going to be tackling internet pornography. So we're going to stick with our Thursday night time frame, 8 p.m. Mountain Time. Next week, internet pornography. Thanks for tuning in, and goodbye for now.